We would like to thank Dr. Wellman for his presentation, and we would like to invite our guest speakers to come forward to answer a selection of questions from the audience. Professor Cristian Rojas, who's an academic of the School of Education of the Catholic University of Chile, and the director of PEL magazine will coordinate the question and answer session. So please come forward, our guest speakers and Professor Rojas. Good afternoon. I would like to thank our guest speakers once again for their attendance, for their conceptual clarity, and all of you for the patience you have shown this morning. We have received many questions. Unfortunately, we were only able to select a few. We'll ask 3 questions each speaker. We will start with the order of the presentations. We'll start with Dr. Reda. And the first question is, have you examined other environmental variables that can help explain individual differences in cognitive attention? For instance, different stress factors in the environment? Well, no, we have not done that directly. Well, we have looked at other aspects because the questionnaire that we use to classify the home environment does include many other factors regarding extracurricular activities and also the time they spend doing different activities like watching TV or playing video games, so on and so forth. Or one of the variables that we got interesting data from is the time that the parents spend reading to children, because the children in our studies were 5 or 6 years old, so we measured the time that the parents used to read to their children, and that was a very interesting variable that gave us results that the more parents read to children, the better their performance was. We know, and there are studies that show the effect of other factors that are probably intertwined in that measurement of socioeconomic status that I showed you, that are factors such as nutrition or diet, the stress in the family, so on and so forth. And yes, there are other studies that show the important effect of stress, nutrition, etc. So we did not address this directly, but I know for a fact that that is very important, and therefore breaking down all those factors will become important when it comes to understanding better why the social environment or that social status measurement has such a great impact on cognition. Another question that has to do with something that has been quite discussed is the issue of being bilingual. Do you think there's an advantage to that in the case of executive attention? But does bilingualism affect that positively? Yes, I know that controversy quite well. In Granada, there are some colleagues who study bilingualism, and I know the controversy about whether really bilingualism does produce an improvement as regards executive attention. I believe that bilingualism, it makes sense to say that it is a training and a natural training, because if we need to manage 2 different languages, there are places like Catalonia, for instance, where the handling both languages, you're speaking both languages constantly. You speak Catalonian at home, but maybe at school you speak Spanish, and or the other way around. So when that occurs, that constant training clearly shows that there's a control of attention. You're actually working on the language acquisition and language representation, and I think that in those circumstances there are facts that show that growing in a bilingual setting with those characteristics does improve the control of attention. It helps children control attention, and there's a lot of data that proves that. But we must distinguish between that bilingualism, in which we must use simultaneously both languages and shift from one to the other almost immediately, with the fact of just knowing one language, another language, a second language, which you use only when it becomes necessary, but you're not really exposed to that need of changing from one language to the other constantly. So I think that the type of bilingualism is also important to determine whether in fact this improves other functions such as the executive functions or not. And the last question has to do with something that I personally find interesting, is that beyond the direct stimulus through a game, what you added, like what you spoke about, that's metacognitive cognition coaching, which brings us closer to the educational field where teachers can perform a very important role. And so the question is, what would be the key characteristics of this metacognitive coaching, and if teachers could do this in the classroom themselves? Well, metacognitive coaching is very similar to what Professor Willman was speaking of. And I saw how, in fact, asking children to explain why something is in such a way makes them reflect upon the concrete situation and the important characteristics to highlight. In our coaching, we emphasize, on the one hand, the knowledge of the exercise that the child was doing, like when he was playing with that sheep, and what was important in that exercise, of course, to look at the space before you press the key. So it was important for them to take a minute at some time to do that. So to help the child reflect on what the characteristics of an activity are, to be able to perform that activity well. So always addressing that dialogue by asking the child questions, saying, what do you think is important for that? And working on the answers so that they become more aware, they have a metacognitive notion of what they are doing. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand is the metacognitive regulation, which is using that knowledge to generate a strategy that will allow the child to succeed in the task, and to also know when it's time to call for help. So, for instance, based on errors, you can say, why do you think you've made a mistake? And the student can say, okay, maybe I went too fast, or maybe I made a mistake because I'm bored by this activity. So in one case or the other, whether it's for one reason or another, the strategy to avoid falling again and making that mistake will be different. If I've been doing it too fast, the strategy is to stop and slow down. But if I'm becoming bored, the strategy is to ask for a change of activity, saying I need another activity because this one is not really motivating me. So making the child more aware of the fact that errors have different causes, and that those causes can be addressed differently. That was something that was important for the regulation of their own behavior. So we worked with all of those aspects, but the truth is that we haven't done that just to see which one is more important among them. But we definitely believe that creating a mental model in the head of the child regarding the activity he or she is performing, so that they can be more aware of what they're doing, is absolutely important for them to be able to generalize and apply that knowledge to other domains, so that they can use what they have learned in different circumstances. Thank you very much. We will now move on to Dr. Pena. And before asking you a question, it's a real short question. It's just a clarification they need. They say, is it nap or the nocturnal sleep at night, that has an effect on this? Well, both types of sleep. But in preschool children, particularly, we were measuring naps. But of course, if you're deprived of sleep at night, you will have difficulty memorizing and learning. And now the other question, what do you suggest to educators so that they can accelerate the application of neuroscience to the field of education? Can something be done to do that? I think that much can be done, but mainly the main strategy must come from the educators themselves. I come from the world of science. I come from another part, and of course, I'm interested in, of course, everybody gaining knowledge, and for there to be some sort of training for educators and caregivers in this area so that they're aware of the fact that these things exist, that there are findings that we have, and that there's new information emerging, and they can take this as a repertoire for learning certain skills. For instance, in reading, it doesn't mean that the children can fail in all aspects of reading for them to have difficulty reading. There could be some aspects that could be trainable or not. We must always be open to the fact that there's always new information emerging. But as regards strategies, specific strategies, I think that I would ask educators to become involved, to want to be involved, to issue opinions, and to tell the people who are designing the curricula or who do teacher training, to explain to them, to tell them that this has a priority, in understanding why the phenomena of learning occur. And that, of course, will require political support. In our Catholic university and in the world, we want to have teachers who know what the neural basis of learning are. And if we want to achieve that, what changes do we need to install in the curriculum? What workshops must we deliver to them? That's a practical aspect that I proposed to a minister of education. I can't remember the name. Is that I remember that when they were speaking about the fact that teachers in the summer had to go through teacher development, professional development sessions, I said, why don't you, for instance, if there's a teacher who's interested in science, why doesn't he during the year do an experiment? Maybe he can pose a question and then work on that question for a whole semester, and then that can be the equivalent for this professional development, something that is intuitive, because I'm sure that teachers are full of suggestions, or they're the most the better condition to actually answer those questions too. So you answered part of the second question, which is whether you consider it relevant to include this in initial teacher training. Now perhaps the suggestion is to include this in initial teacher training, but also in the training of neurologists and pediatricians, to include some of these elements of education so that the language can be more fluent and the dialogue can be fluent. And the last question says, or asks, whether there's a scientific certainty regarding a relationship between learning and a safe emotional environment. If there's a relationship between those two. You mean learning under stress? There are studies. I am more familiar with the studies in animals or in really stressing situations, such as in case of orphans in Romania. And in fact, in their situations of neglect, of emotional neglect, learning is clearly impacted. Now, if there are any specific studies, for instance, in children who are not in such tragic circumstances, that's possible too. I think that emotional support, or the fact that the child receives regular rewards, and and then people congratulate him on his achievements or her achievements, that stimulates them to continue learning. Evidently, we could all learn without any rewards, but of course, in emotional environments, there's a crucial role in the situations that favor learning in too in children, and there are many studies. Charles Nelson and Marta Kutas have studied poverty and orphans. They have done those studies in some countries where there has been war. Finally, Dr. Wellman, the first question is, how does theory of mind help us with children with behavior problems or lack of tolerance to frustration? How does theory of mind help in those cases? Children with behavior problems or with, as I said before.
So one thing to say about theory of mind is that when you understand the social world better, you don't always use it for good, right? You can be Machiavellian, you can use it for evil, you can use it to lie, as I told you about. So it's not always something that you use for good. But one of the things that's related to theory of mind that usually is good is if you encourage children to understand what's happening from somebody else's perspective, right? That there are diverse desires, that there are diverse beliefs, people can have different opinions. So if you encourage children to understand how things are happening from somebody else's perspective, oftentimes that translates into using these sorts of knowledge and understanding more for other people or more in a larger and less selfish sort of way. But not always, right? You guys know a lot about social cognition. Are you always nice? Are you sometimes mean? Do you always, sometimes, right? But if you understand more about other people's and the diversity of ideas and stuff, that usually helps, and there's data that show that.
Thank you very much. Second question. How can the theory of mind help teachers to improve student learning?
Well, I think what I was talking about at the end of my talk is perhaps one of the biggest take-home areas. I should stay. I began with a personal story. Another personal story of mine is that before I went to graduate school, started doing all this, I was a preschool teacher. So I was a preschool teacher, then I went to, and this shapes my answer and also my interests. So I think that teachers that speak to the fact that children really want to understand, not just perform correctly, right? But they want to understand. That's the power of these explanations, that this is an amazingly powerful teaching technique. It's also good for teachers, right? You get more passion for what you're doing if what you think your task is to understand what they're thinking, not just to teach them something new, right? Not just teach to the test, but understand them. And there's lots of research that suggests that to the extent you understand where children are now better, then you're better able to shape how you want them to learn differently and get to something else. So theory of mind suggests that as teachers, a good thing to do is try to understand what your students want, okay? Now that's not everything. I heard the other questions. So this is a model of teacher and child interaction in the classroom that's about exploration. Let's find out together. What are you thinking? What am I thinking? There's limits to that, of course. But even for any of that to go forward, children have to feel safe in their classrooms, right? All the way back to attachment theory. We know that there's a trade-off between exploration, feeling free to learn, and having a safe base for exploration. So children have to feel safe with their teachers and with their friends too. So keep them safe and ask them what they think.
Very well. And finally, it is has already somewhat been answered how to work on understanding in the classroom. I don't know if you would like to add something else, but also whether asking for explanations improving their correct answers and learning.
Yes. But can I say two other things? Okay. So one of the earlier points raised by Dr. Pina was about critical periods and differences between critical periods. And she was interested in experiences that help critical periods stay open longer. But the other side of that is, for what sorts of skills and knowledge are there critical periods, and critical periods staying open longer and longer and longer to adulthood. So in case you're interested, deaf children has been one of the places where understanding critical periods for language, that's been a very, very useful set of research. And in our research on deaf children, I can say there's no critical period for theory of mind development, not the things that I was talking about. These things that normatively happen in those preschool years, you're not foreclosed from understanding them if you don't get them in the 3 years. These deaf children and adults that we work, they continue to learn some of these sorts of things into their 40s and into their 50s. Okay, it's not closed off. And then the other thing I wanted to say is being bilingual helps your theory of mind too. Above and beyond executive functions, which we know it also helps your ability to understand people. So.
Thank you. And just to close, I would like to leave 3 major ideas with you based on what we've heard today. I would say that on the one hand, the title of this seminar attempted to emphasize cognitive processes, but based on what we've heard today, evidently, when we want to address the issue of learning, we must be aware of the cognitive and non-cognitive processes involved, socio-emotional processes, executive functions, and we cannot leave these things out. They must always be present if we really want to achieve that learning. A second idea that seemingly is this up to only researchers, or is there also a role to be played here by teachers, decision makers, so many agents that are involved in this? So therefore we must also be accountable for our part and not leave the responsibility to someone else. Well, the fact that you are here is in itself proof that you are concerned with this topic and you want to have this dialogue. And finally, the importance of stimulation. Early stimulation, not limited to the early period only, but that period, it plays a very important role. And there is international evidence, but also national evidence showing how to have an impact in the classroom and the transfer of academic skills and capacities. And we, at the School of Education, we have very interesting studies on how stimulating executive functions in the classroom can turn students into people with a better cognitive development, and that this in turn turns into better learners, and they have better performances in language and mathematics. So there's a lot of evidence. The evidence is also in Chile, and hopefully you can bring this to your classroom. A very important role to play. That is, thank you all very much, and I will now leave you for the wrap-up.
Thank you, Professor Rojas, all our guest speakers, and everyone here today, and PEL of the School of Education of the Catholic University of Chile would like to thank everyone for attending, and we would like to remind you to visit our website at the end of this month so that you find out and can read the new issue of our magazine, and all of the previous issues are also available at that website. Good afternoon, and we hope you can come to the 5th seminar of PEL next year. Thank you very much.